Welcome to video 3 of the Breezy Bunting Sew Along, also called the Use Your Roll Sew Along. Hopefully by this point you have most of your blocks pieced and you're ready to start assembling your quilt. This video will be very brief and I'll just walk you through some of the steps to put your final quilt together and share a few tips with you, mostly tips on how to keep your blocks kind of straight as you go across, because some of them are dropped down halfway, and sometimes I notice when I sew quilts together that there's like a half drop on a block that over like the course of the quilt my blocks kind of go sideways. So I'll give you some tips that I figured out to help me avoid that. And like I said, this is the third video in the series. Our next quilt along is going to be the Spooky Shelfie quilt, and I will talk a lot more in detail about that coming up. That is due to start in July. Hey guys, welcome back to the Breezy Bunting Quilt Along. This is the third instructional video. It's actually the fourth video in the series, but it's the third instructional video, and we are talking about the final assembly on our quilt. For these steps, you will need your pattern. On the pattern, you've got diagrams and everything tells you what size to cut your sashing pieces, how to assemble them. It's pretty straightforward. The quilt is assembled by columns. I want to give you a couple tips before we do the final assembly. The first is, I tried to film this for YouTube, but it didn't work very well because it's vertical and YouTube is horizontal. So if you go to my Instagram, which is @polka.chair, and you come into the highlight bubble called Quilt Along, I talk about the quilt along. You can kind of scroll through the stories, so I show here how I laid my quilt out on my design wall. I showed you the design wall I used and gave you tips for laying out your quilt. So I definitely think take a minute and watch that if you kind of want to know the best way to arrange all of the blocks on the quilt. It just was a better format for Instagram, like I mentioned, because it's vertical. So it was just like, I have a narrow room and I just couldn't get the whole thing in if I turned it the other way. So all of that is linked in there, and there's links to the videos and to the pattern, and it's just @polka.chair. So let's get to assembling the quilt. As I mentioned before, it's straightforward, but I do have a tip for you. So these blocks are sewn together alternating, and you have 9 columns of blocks. If this is off by a 1/4 inch here, and then off by another 1/4 inch here, and off by another 1/4 inch here, by the time you get to that 9th row, you can have your quilt be off by a couple inches. And while I don't usually stress too much about my quilts being perfectly square, it's an amount that it may be visibly out of square. So I want to give you a tip that I use when I sew quilts together like this. I do this pretty much with any quilt that has sashing. So I have my next row, and I like to just label my binding clips so I know which row I'm working with. And this next row is going to get sewn here. And I want to make sure that this point and this point line up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use my quilt ruler and a pen that erases and just draw a line right there. Then when I pin this piece to this, I'm going to make sure that that seam is right on that line, and then I know as I work across my quilt that all of my pieces are going to stay lined up as I work. And then this is just a small piece. This is not my full sashing, but just to give you an idea. And then when I get this other sashing on the other side for this block, I'll do the same thing. Draw a line straight across, use the ruler to make sure you keep everything square. And then as you sew your columns together, that should help you keep everything nice and straight. I recommend just starting always sewing from the top down to help keep things lined up as well. So I always start at the top and sew down. I know that can be controversial. Some people like to sew both directions to keep things from stretching, but I like to do it that way. And then I personally believe that in this case it's going to be better to press these seams open on the back of the quilt. Anytime that I have like a long seam, I just notice I get much better results if I press seams open. Sometimes when you press them to the side, they have a tendency to get kind of wobbly as you go down the quilt. As I mentioned before, this is the fourth and final video in the Quilt Along series. I would love to see your finished quilts. If you can tag me on Instagram or mention me at Polka Dot Chair or use a hashtag Polka Dot Chair so that I can find you, then I would love to see them. I do show and tells on my blog. Try to do probably 2 a month, and I love to share you guys' creations and help everybody see all the amazing things that you're making. Our next quilt along is going to be starting in August, and right at the beginning of August, and it is going to be a Halloween quilt along for my spooky shelfie quilt. I will drop a photo in so you guys can see it. I'm really excited about it. Subscribe to my newsletter. Just go to polkadotchair.com, click on subscribe on the top, and you'll get notified. And thanks so much for sewing along with me.